"It's not my baby," she pleaded, her voice cracking like dry leather in the desert heat. But Jake Morrison had already seen enough to know she was lying. The woman stood in his doorway, silhouetted against the dying amber light of dusk, clutching a bundle that moved with the restless stirring of new life. Her dress was torn at the shoulder, dust-caked and travel-worn, and her dark hair hung in tangles that spoke of days on the road. But it was her eyes that held him, wide, desperate, the kind of fear that came from being hunted. "Please," she whispered again, and this time her knees buckled. Jake caught her before she hit the porch boards, his calloused hands steadying her trembling frame. The baby, no more than a few months old, let out a soft cry that seemed to pierce the evening stillness of his remote ranch. He'd built this place 15 miles from the nearest town for a reason: solitude, peace, no complications. This woman was nothing but complications. "Ma'am, you need to sit down." He guided her to the wooden chair by his door, noting how she never loosened her grip on the child. "When's the last time you ate?" She didn't answer, just stared at him with those haunted eyes. In the fading light, he could make out more details: the fine bones of her face beneath the grime, the quality fabric of her dress despite its condition. This wasn't some drifter or saloon girl. This was a lady who'd fallen far from wherever she'd started. "I can pay," she said suddenly, fumbling in her skirts with one hand while balancing the baby with the other. "I have money, I just need keep your money." Jake's voice came out rougher than intended. "You look half dead. Come inside." She hesitated, weighing trust against desperation. Desperation won. As she rose to follow him, something metallic caught the last rays of sunlight. A chain around her neck, mostly hidden beneath her collar, but the pendant had worked loose during her struggle to stay upright. A locket, silver, expensive, engraved. And when Jake saw what was etched into its surface, the blood in his veins turned to ice water. His own name, carved in elegant script, Jacob Morrison. Below it, a date from 5 years ago, a date he'd tried his best to forget. The woman noticed his stare and quickly tucked the locket back beneath her dress, but it was too late. The damage was done. Jake Morrison, who'd spent half a decade running from his past, had just watched it walk up to his front door, carrying a baby that couldn't possibly be his. Could it? Inside the dim warmth of his cabin, Jake set a pot of coffee to boil while the woman, she still hadn't given her name, settled the baby on his worn couch. The child was beautiful, he had to admit, with dark hair and skin that glowed golden in the firelight. But beauty didn't answer the questions burning in his chest. "That locket," he said without turning around. "Where did you get it?" Her silence stretched so long he thought she might not answer. When he finally faced her, she was staring into the fire, her expression unreadable. "You know where." "Do I?" Jake poured 2 cups of coffee, his hands steady despite the storm brewing inside him. "Because I seem to recall giving that particular piece to someone else entirely. Someone who told me she never wanted to see me again." The woman's composure cracked just slightly. "Eleanor's dead, Jake." The words hit him like a physical blow. Eleanor Whitmore, the banker's daughter from Denver, the woman who'd worn his ring for exactly 3 weeks before deciding that a cowboy's love wasn't worth the scandal it would cause her family. She'd thrown the locket back at him the last night he'd seen her, along with words that had cut deeper than any knife. When his voice came out as barely more than a whisper, 6 months ago, fever took her. She looked down at the baby, who was sleeping now, tiny fist curled against its cheek. "She made me promise to bring the baby to you, said you had a right to know." Jake's mind reeled. The timing was wrong, all wrong. When he'd left Denver, Eleanor had been very much alive and very much finished with him. There'd been no mention of a child, no hint that their brief engagement had left any lasting consequences. "What's your name?" he asked. Sarah Whitmore." "Eleanor was my sister." That explained the resemblance, the refined features beneath the travel-worn exterior. It also explained why she'd risk everything to fulfill a dying sister's promise. "The baby," Jake said carefully. "Boy or girl?" "Girl. Her name is Grace." Sarah's voice softened when she spoke the name. "Eleanor called her Grace," because she said the child was the only beautiful thing that came from her mistakes. Mistakes. Jake closed his eyes, trying to calculate dates and possibilities. He and Eleanor had been intimate exactly once, the night before their engagement ended. It had been desperate and passionate, and utterly foolish. Two people grasping at something they both knew was already slipping away. Sarah. He opened his eyes to find her watching him with a mixture of hope and terror. If this child is mine, why didn't Eleanor tell me? Because she was already promised to another man, someone her father chose, someone who could give her the life she thought she wanted. Sarah's voice turned bitter. She married him 2 months after you left, told everyone the baby came early. Outside, Jake heard the distant sound of hoofbeats, multiple horses, moving fast. Sarah heard it too. Her face went white as fresh snow. They found me, she whispered. The horses stopped just outside the reach of the cabin's lamplight, but Jake could see the silhouettes of at least 4 riders. Their horses snorted and stamped, still heated from hard riding. Whoever they were, they'd been pushing their mounts to catch up. Sarah Whitmore. The voice that called out was cultured, authoritative. I know you're in there. Come out, and bring the child. Sarah's face went ashen. She clutched little Grace tighter, and the baby stirred at the sudden tension in the room. Who is that? Jake asked, though he was already moving toward his rifle. Charles Blackwood, Eleanor's husband. The words came out like a confession. He thinks Grace is his daughter. Eleanor never told him the truth. Jake's blood ran cold. Blackwood, he knew that name. Rich, powerful, with connections that reached into every courthouse and sheriff's office from Denver to Santa Fe. Not the kind of man you crossed lightly. Mrs. Whitmore, Blackwood called again, his voice closer now. You've committed kidnapping. Return my daughter, and I'll consider showing mercy. She's not his. Sarah hissed. Eleanor told me everything before she died. He was cruel to her, Jake. Cruel in ways that don't leave visible marks. She was terrified of what he'd do to Grace. The sound of boots on his porch made Jake's decision for him. He grabbed his Winchester and moved to the window, staying out of sight as he peered through a gap in the curtains. 4 men, all armed, with Blackwood in the lead. The man was tall, well-dressed despite the hard ride, with the kind of face that had never known doubt or defeat. Morrison. Blackwood had spotted movement in the window. I know she's in there. This doesn't concern you. Hand over the child and the woman, and you can go back to your quiet life. Jake looked back at Sarah, who was now standing with Grace pressed against her shoulder. The baby was awake, looking around with curious dark eyes that seemed far too knowing for such a young face. Those eyes. Jake's heart nearly stopped as he really looked at the child for the first time. Those weren't Eleanor's pale blue eyes, or even Sarah's brown ones. They were gray-green, flecked with gold around the edges, just like his own. There's a back way out, he said quietly to Sarah. Through the kitchen. My horse is in the stable. No. Sarah's voice was firm despite her fear. I won't run anymore, and neither should you. She looked at him meaningfully. She's your daughter, Jake. Are you going to let him take her? Outside, Blackwood's patience was wearing thin. I'm coming in, Morrison. Last chance to do this the easy way. Jake heard the distinctive sound of hammers being pulled back on multiple weapons. In his arms, little Grace made a soft cooing sound, as if she were perfectly content despite the danger surrounding them. His daughter. The words echoed in his mind like a bell tolling. After years of believing he'd never have a family, never have anything worth fighting for beyond his own survival, fate had delivered both to his doorstep. The front door exploded inward. Drop the rifle, Morrison. Blackwood stood framed in the splintered doorway, his own weapon trained on Jake's chest. Behind him, 3 hired guns spread out, covering the room with military precision. Jake kept his Winchester steady, though he knew the odds were hopeless. This is my land, Blackwood. You're trespassing. I'm reclaiming stolen property. Blackwood's cold gaze moved to Sarah and the baby. My wife died in childbirth, Morrison. That child is all I have left of her. Your wife died of fever, Sarah said, her voice stronger than Jake expected. And you made her life miserable every day she lived. Something dangerous flickered in Blackwood's eyes. You always were jealous of Eleanor, Sarah. Even now you can't let her rest in peace. I can't let her daughter suffer the same fate she did." Jake watched the exchange, noting how Blackwood never actually looked at Grace, not really looked. The man saw a possession, an inheritance, but not a child, certainly not his child. "She has Eleanor's nose," Blackwood said suddenly, as if trying to convince himself. "The same delicate features." But Jake was close enough to see what Blackwood couldn't, or wouldn't. Grace had his stubborn chin, his mother's high cheekbones, and when the baby turned her head at the sound of his voice, she studied his face with an intensity that made his chest tight. "Tell me something, Blackwood," Jake said, inspiration striking. "What color were Eleanor's eyes?" "Blue, of course. The palest blue, like winter sky." Blackwood's voice held genuine emotion for the first time. "Look at the child's eyes." For a moment silence filled the cabin. Blackwood stepped closer, peering at Grace for the first time with real attention. Jake watched the man's face change as he registered what he was seeing. "Gray," Blackwood whispered. "They're gray, like mine," Jake said quietly. The truth hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Blackwood's face went through a series of emotions: confusion, realization, rage, and finally something that might have been relief. "She lied to me," he said, more to himself than anyone else. "All this time she lied. She was trying to protect her daughter," Sarah said, "and herself." Blackwood lowered his weapon slowly, his shoulders sagging as if a great weight had been lifted. "I mourned a child who was never mine, chased across 2 territories for a lie." Jake kept his rifle ready, not trusting the sudden change. "What now?" "Now," Blackwood looked around the cabin as if seeing it for the first time. "Now I go home and try to figure out how to rebuild a life that was built on deception." He holstered his gun and nodded to his men, who reluctantly followed suit. At the door he paused. "Morrison, that child deserves better than to be raised by a man who doesn't want her." "Who says I don't want her?" Blackwood studied Jake's face for a long moment, then nodded. "Eleanor chose better than I thought." He touched the brim of his hat to Sarah. "Ma'am, I'm sorry for your loss, and for the chase." Then he was gone, taking his men with him, leaving only the sound of hoofbeats fading into the night. In the sudden quiet that followed Blackwood's departure, Jake found himself alone with Sarah and the baby who might be his daughter. Grace was fussing now, hungry and tired from the evening's excitement. "She needs to eat," Sarah said, but she was looking at Jake with an expression he couldn't quite read. "And we need to talk." Jake set his rifle aside and moved to the stove, warming milk he'd bought from a neighbor the week before. As he worked he was acutely aware of Sarah's presence, of the way she hummed softly to quiet Grace, of how natural she looked holding a child. "You don't have to stay," he said without turning around. "If Grace is mine, I'll take responsibility, but you're free to go wherever you were headed." "I wasn't headed anywhere." Sarah's voice was soft. "I've been running since Eleanor died, trying to figure out how to keep a promise to a sister who spent her whole life making the wrong choices. Truth is, I don't have anywhere to go." Jake tested the milk temperature on his wrist, the way he'd seen his mother do years ago. "This is a hard life out here, lonely, no place for a lady. I stopped being a lady the day I stole a baby from her legal guardian and ran." There was something like humor in Sarah's voice. "Besides, what makes you think you'd be raising her alone?" He turned to find her watching him with eyes that held none of the desperation he'd seen earlier. Instead there was something steady and sure, something that spoke of choices made with full knowledge of their consequences. "Sarah, Eleanor told me about you, you know, before she died." Sarah shifted Grace to her shoulder, patting the baby's back gently. "She said you were the only man she'd ever met who looked at her like she was worth something beyond her father's money. She regretted sending you away every day of her marriage." Jake brought the bottle over, watching as Sarah tested it herself before offering it to Grace. The baby latched on immediately, her tiny hands gripping Sarah's fingers. "She also said," Sarah continued, "that if anything ever happened to her, she hoped Grace would find her way to someone who could love her the way Eleanor never learned to love herself." They sat in silence as Grace drank, the fire crackling softly in the grate. Jake found himself studying both of them, the woman who'd risked everything to keep a promise, and the child who'd somehow brought purpose to his empty life in the span of a single evening. "I don't know how to be a father," he admitted. "I don't know how to be a mother," Sarah replied, "but I know how to love someone enough to try." Outside, the night had settled into peaceful quiet, broken only by the distant call of a coyote and the soft sound of Grace finishing her bottle. Jake reached over and took the baby from Sarah, marveling at how perfectly she fit in his arms. Grace looked up at him with those remarkable gray-green eyes, and he saw his future written there, not the solitary existence he'd planned, but something richer and more complicated, and infinitely more worthwhile. "Well then," he said, looking from his daughter to the woman who'd brought her to him, "I guess we'd better figure it out together." Years later, when Grace Morrison was old enough to ask about the night her family came together, Jake would tell her about the woman who rode through danger to keep a promise, and about how sometimes the best things in life arrive at your door when you least expect them. But that night, as Sarah fell asleep in his chair, and Grace dozed against his shoulder, Jake simply sat by the dying fire, and marveled at how quickly a man's whole world could change. In the morning, there would be plans to make and decisions to face, but for now, there was only the soft breathing of his newfound family, and the knowledge that some promises once kept create bonds stronger than blood and deeper than time. The locket still lay against Sarah's throat, catching the last flickers of firelight like a talisman of second chances and unexpected grace.